If you don't know what that is, it's a really interdisciplinary field where people who study cultural evolution have backgrounds in biology, anthropology, psychology, economics, maths, and we use tools from evolutionary biology to try to answer big questions to do with the evolution of human behavior. So in particular, we focus on, why are humans so different from other species, and more specifically, why is culture so adaptive? Why do we have the kind of cultural abilities, and why is culture so useful for human survival? And what I mean here by culture is really broad. So it's socially learned behavior that is passed on across generations. So that includes things like tools, technology, but also language, institutions, and norms. And cultural evolution in particular is really good at explaining how individual level decisions translate into population level patterns. And it's doing that by focusing on different level analysis and using kind of different approaches. But also, in addition to asking why we have culture, we also use cultural evolution to explain how cultural products change over time. And today I'm going to talk about a particular type of cultural change where populations build on and improve knowledge and skill from previous generations. In this process of cumulative cultural evolution, where kind of improvements accumulate over time, can lead to really complex knowledge and tools and cultural products that no one individual could have invented on their own. So a lot of tools actually evolved through this process of cumulative cultural evolution. And the example of the evolution of a hammer over time here illustrated is a really classic example where populations adopt simpler solutions and they improve them a little bit, but through this process of incremental improvement over time, we go from very simple designs here on the left to very complex, very efficient designs. This is a steam hammer, I think. So what's interesting about this process is that individuals using tools don't necessarily need to know how to make all these previous designs in order to use the tools and sometimes even to improve the tools. So you just kind of need to learn the most recent, the most efficient one and start from there. And having knowledge of this history sometimes is useful, sometimes it's not necessary. And another example I really like, because I think it really shows the type of complex problems that cumulative cultural evolution solves, is this example of cassava processing. So this is a bit of a go-to example in the cultural evolution literature. And if you're interested in these kind of things, Joe Henrich has a book from 2015 that I really recommend. It's like a really kind of a pop sciencey write-up of the findings in cultural evolution. And it's really readable, has a lot of really good anthropological examples. So cassava is native to South America, and it's a plant whose root is the major source of carbohydrates in staple food in many countries in South America, but also in Africa and Asia. And cassava, in particular, bitter cassava, is really toxic. It contains cyanide. So it requires a complex preparation ritual to make it edible. So this is typically, this ritual differs across communities, but typically is a multi-day, multi-step process that involves some sort of combination of peeling, grating, soaking, drying, fermenting, and cooking this cassava. And what makes cassava really tricky is actually some processing will reduce the bitter taste and the risk of immediate cyanide poisoning. But actually, slow poisoning with cyanide can lead to things like nerve damage and paralysis and even death. So learning how to process cassava is not actually easy through trial and error, right? Because the effects are not immediate, but cumulative cultural evolution here is very successful. So steps are incrementally incorporated in this complex ritual that effectively solves this problem. So with this in mind, cumulative cultural evolution is actually very difficult to study because of the scale that it operates on. So it's a population level process. It could take thousands of years. And if we're interested in how it works and kind of describing these dynamics, we can use, people have been using two methods, either modeling or experimental methods. And this process was one of the main things that cultural evolution was interested in. So there's quite a lot of like big picture, broad, general, big scale models looking at how and why it works. But obviously there's not that much granularity in these models. So if we're interested at the individual level, people have been using smaller scales of this process in the lab. And these models in the lab look something like this. So most of these studies have been using a transmission chain experiment paradigm or iterated learning paradigm, where basically you have groups of individuals in the lab, and some are building, some are observing, and after a fixed period of time, the builders become, the observers become the builders, and then the builders get replaced by naive individuals who are observing. So Under this kind of simulated intergeneration transmission, chains of participants improve over time. So we can study this process in the lab, and here are some tasks that have been used before. So here the participants are asked to build a paper airplane, and they measured how far the paper airplane flies, or build a spaghetti tower and measure how tall that spaghetti tower is. These tasks here have asked participants to build these virtual arrowheads or virtual fishing nets, and then kind of measure how they do against the set success function. This is an example from a study that has asked participants to reproduce this graphical symbol. This is another task that has asked participants to combine different potions in a study of recombination. So, these experiments have been used to study questions to do with cumulative cultural evolution, like what's the role of imitation, or what's the role of group size? But these tasks are quite simple, and most of these experiments use quite simple small groups. So basically, I think the biggest experiment has groups of 20 participants. And the types of problems that cumulative cultural evolution solves look quite different. So we have two fitness landscapes here, where on the left we have a problem with a single peak. This is a simple problem with a single good solution, and like a simple hill climber learner will solve this problem successfully, right? But I think the problems that cumulative cultural evolution solves look more like here on the right. So you have multiple peaks, multiple good solutions, and sometimes individuals can get stuck on these suboptimal peaks, and it's hard to jump from one solution to another. And I think the kind of experiments that people have been using so far look more like this question on this fitness landscape on the left, and not like the one on the right that we're actually trying to explore. So in my PhD, we actually used like a really cool model that is kind of a middle ground between these two, where we use the data set from an online programming competition. So this data set is the result of a contest organized by the people who produce MATLAB. And for 15 years, they've been running this programming contest that attracts hundreds of participants every year. The participants compete mostly for reputation. They don't get any prizes. And in every contest over the course of 1 week, the organizers set up a problem and participants submit solution, as many as they want, in the form of MATLAB code, aiming to achieve the best score. And what makes this contest unique is that it's collaborative. So once an entry is submitted, it becomes public. So both the code and the entry, so the code of the entry and the score of the entry also are public, and they can be used by all the other participants. So what happens is actually participants copy each other a lot. And each contest produces a collection of code artifacts that evolve over time through gradual modification by multiple individuals. So basically, each contest is a microcosm of cumulative cultural evolution. So this is a simple example. These problems are typical computer science problems, but they're NP hard. So that means there's no exact computational solution to them. So there's always like an option for open-ended improvement in task. And this is an example where basically participants are asked to make a crossword, where you're giving a list of acceptable words and a grid size, and you're asked to find the grid that fits as many words as possible. So this is what the question looks like, then the answer would look like this. So this is basically a function in MATLAB that solves that problem. And these functions can get very long, up to hundreds of lines of code. And by the end of the contest, every contest kind of consists of 2,000 or 3,000 of such entries. Right, so I'm gonna jump into the results straight away. Here are the scores of all the entries in one contest over time. Bear in mind that a lower score here is good. So it's very clear that these scores are improving over time. And here the red line is following the leading entries. So those are the entries that at the time of their submission improve this overall score. And you can see from this graph, there's a very small number of these leading entries. And actually most entries don't do that well. So this is a difficult problem. But actually, the scores improve throughout all the contests. So the population overall manages to tackle this task successfully. And for all the analysis, I used line-based measures, where basically every entry is a collection of lines of code. And we're looking at things like whether those lines are new or copied and who they're copied from. As improvement becomes really difficult throughout the contest, participants actually resort to copying the best entries. So as a result, most entries introduce very little novelty, which we measure here as the proportion of new lines of code that each entry has submitted to the contest. So here, most entries have, show very little novelty. So actually, 90% of the entries introduce less than 10% novelty, and only 0.05% of entries are 90% novel. And as solutions improve, the diversity of these lines of code is decreasing over time. So we measure this diversity as the proportion of unique lines of code in the population in a given time interval. And as you can see from this graph, that diversity is going down, and that's because contestants increasingly focus on copying and tweaking the current leader. We looked at the similarity of these solutions over time. And the reason why this diversity is going down is because the similarity is going up. So we measured the similarity again using a line-based measure that takes into account the number of lines two pieces of code have in common relative to their respective lengths. And here I'm plotting a similarity matrix between all the entries in one contest, ordered chronologically from top to bottom and left to right. And here a lighter color is a higher similarity. And each line here is basically the similarity between one entry and all the other entries, again, ordered chronologically. So for example, this would be the similarity between entry 1000 and all the other entries. And you can see the similarity between entry 1000 and itself and the ones around it is quite high. And the similarity between entry 1000 and 2000 is quite low. And I guess here time kind of flows from top left to bottom right. So you can see that the similarity increases over time. It's higher here at the bottom. But also what these graphs are showing is that the population is converging on these similar solutions for periods of time. So these bright squares are periods of convergence, and then populations switch from one idea to another. So basically, every entry is a collection of lines, and we just measured how many of those lines are identical in two entries. So that's this, over the length of the first entry plus the length of the second entry. So we've described this dynamic in terms of tweaks and leaps. So basically, the population is converging on a solution for a period of time. It adopts the solution, it optimizes it, it tweaks it. And then when a new good solution is introduced to the population, then the population kind of leaps to this new idea and continues to tweak this new idea. So there's quite a lot of variation in these patterns of tweaks and leaps between different contests. And sometimes new ideas are based on previous one, like in this example here. So this idea is quite similar to this idea, like the similarity here is quite big. Sometimes these ideas are completely different, like in this case. Sometimes people revert to previous ideas, like they do in this example here. This, the population converges on this solution, then switches to a new solution, then switches to the previous solution again. But we see consistent periods of tweaks and leaps. And if we're wondering what drives the population to jump to these new ideas, we looked at the leading entries. So again, these are the entries that do better than the current best at the time of their submission. And there was a negative correlation between similarity to previous leader and improvement in score in the leading entry. So what this means is that a tweak, so a small similarity, is associating with a small improvement in score. But if somebody sometimes comes up with a very different solution that makes a large improvement, then that what drives the population to switch. And while this is true for the leaders, that more novelty is associated with higher improvement, with better score, actually the picture changes dramatically if you look at the entire population, where there's again a negative correlation between the similarity to the current leader and the difference in score. But remember that actually most entries have a worse score than the current best. So actually here, a large difference means a really bad score. So what this translates to is that in the entire population, the more dissimilar your entry will be from the current best, the worse your score will be. So basically copying here is a low risk strategy. Sometimes you'll do a little better, sometimes you'll do a little worse than the current consensus. But on the other hand, not copying is actually very high risk. So if you're good, it will be associated with a really high improvement, but more often than not, it will be associated with a much lower score than the current best. So the safe choice is to copy, and it's quite clear from these pictures that's what participants do. So there's quite a large number of tweaks and very few leaps. And again, if we looked at the distribution of similarities to the current leader, this becomes really clear. So here, there's a very, very large number of similar entries with fewer entries diverging from what the population is doing. And that's even stronger in the leading entries, where basically the ratio on leading entries was for 16 tweaks for each leap here. Right, so we're looking at a hard problem, and most improvements are really small. And here the diversity of culture decreases over time because most entries are small modifications of the leading solution. So far I've talked about what makes single entries or single solutions successful. But because in this contest, actually participants can submit as many solutions as they want, and often the same participants take part in more than one contest. We actually were interested in how these individual participants make use of innovation in copying. So in particular, are some individuals consistently successful? What is special about these successful individuals? And also to kind of tie it to the previous literature, we're interested in whether individuals are consistent in the way they use social information. So do they only copy? Do they never copy? Is there somewhere in between? Here, basically every individual participant, we call them authors, is responsible for a collection of entries. So the distribution of those entries that every participant has submitted describes the strategy of that individual. So here, we're first interested in differences in copying. So here I'm plotting the mean and the range of the similarity to the current leader for every author in the contest. And the red bubbles here indicate the authors that become leaders. So the contestants, again, that submitted the best, at least one entry that took the lead. And the size of the bubbles is how many entries they submitted. So we actually found that individuals fit kind of like in 3 groups. So we have a long tail of mavericks here. So these are individuals who never kind of copy and always do their own thing. We have a group of extreme copiers who always kind of copy. And in the middle, we have successful explorers. So basically, these mavericks, there's a couple of red dots here. I'm not sure if you can see them, but these mavericks never really take the lead. And these copiers never really take the lead. So actually, most of the leaders come from this middle category where individuals copy, but they also explore quite a lot. And in terms of how performance varies across individuals, again, we find these 3 groups. We find a group at the bottom here of kind of consistent bad performance. One group here on the right are consistent good performers, and kind of like a group variable individuals in the middle. And I think it's, while it's rare for these bad performers to take the lead, actually it's worth noting that although leaders were consistent in their exploration, they're not actually all doing that well. So if we compare leading authors with non-leading authors, leading authors on average actually stick more closely to the current leader here, but they also have a much higher range of similarities. So basically they're also much more exploratory. And now I'm gonna turn to the third question we asked with this data set, where a lot of the work in cultural evolution has focused on information transmission and how traits spread in the population, and more specifically, who, what, and when people copy. So these kind of social learning strategies that dictate these rules of copying. And there's evidence from both humans and non-human animals that it's a good idea to copy when uncertain. As for what to copy, individuals are quite good at identifying and copying the option with the highest payoff. But actually this is kind of tricky and cognitively complex, right? Like being able to identify what's a good payoff. So sometimes individuals fall back on these kind of proxies for what is successful. And one of these proxies is prestige bias. So instead of trying to figure out which individual is the most successful or what makes that individual successful, it's actually a better idea to pay attention to whom other individuals are paying attention to. So who is prestigious or esteemed is probably someone you want to also pay attention to. So success sometimes is quite domain specific. Prestige can be quite general. So sometimes by copying these prestigious individuals, we actually end up copying things that are not necessarily linked to success. So prestige bias is sometimes invoked to explain things like football players or kind of like advertising soft drinks or whatever. You want to be like this individual, but you don't know what makes this individual successful. So you copy random things. So here, the way I've kind of talked about is prestige is thought to be an alternative to payoff information, but we were wondering if we can still find traces of prestige when we have this payoff information. So here, I answered this question by looking at how different participants are copied. So like I said, we know that individuals kind of develop these like good reputations across contests, and sometimes, within contests, sometimes across contests. And we wanted to see if these good participants are copied more, and if these good reputations kind of carry from contest to contest. So in order to look at this, we had to measure how individuals are copied. So we devised a measure called influence, which is basically just normalized average similarity between an entry and subsequent entries that were submitted by different contestants. So we didn't want to take into account the, kind of a participant developing their own solution, copying themselves, I guess. We want to see if the influence of an entry can be affected by the identity of the person who submitted this entry. And for this, when we have two pieces of information for every entry. Basically, an entry can be a leading entry or a non-leading entry. So a leading entry is the entry that did the best at the time of their submission. And then an author can also be a leading author. So that means that they submitted at least a leading entry in the contest, or a non-leading author. So we expected, obviously, that leading entries will be copied more because we know their payoff, we know they're doing well. But if we also found that non-leading entries that were submitted by leading authors were copied more, then there was something about the identity of the author that was kind of like carried through in this copying process. And if we compare here the influence of leading entries submitted by leading authors, non-leading entries submitted by leading authors and non-leading authors, then that's exactly what we find. So we found that leading entries are copied more, but so are non-leading entries submitted by leading authors. This is cool. And we also wanted to see if this extends across contests. So we integrated data from 19 contests here. And now we have 3 pieces of information. One is an entry is leading. The second piece of information is whether an author was a leading author in the current contest as the entry. And the third piece of information is whether the author was leading author in a different contest as the entry that we're looking at. Like expected, we find that leading entries are copied more, and so are entries submitted by leading authors in this current contest. But we also found that it was true for non-leading entries submitted by an author that was not leading in this current contest, but leading elsewhere. So there's something about being a good contestant that carries across these contests. There's quite a lot of literature out there looking at individual differences and showing that diversity in a population is beneficial. But here we also show that it's not only diversity between individuals, but also within individuals in terms of the strategies that they use. And the individuals only using one strategy, only copying or never copying, actually didn't do as well. So the successful individuals here actually made use of both copying and exploration. And we also found these traces of prestige, even in the presence of payoff information, as successful individuals had more influence. So I'm going to pause here, and because I'm going to move to a different study. Yeah. All right. So I was, so far I've talked about kind of like population level dynamics, but I was also interested in what happens at the individual level in terms of kind of learning mechanisms. So in the cultural evolution literature, cumulative cultural evolution has been generally conceptualized as involving these kind of 2 steps. So first, you're copying from the previous generation of knowledgeable individuals, and then you're innovating individual level innovation. And while I think this distinction is really useful and also makes sense in the kind of like a historical context where these models have been adapted from they're kind of like population genetic models. But, I think this kind of simplifies the diversity of learning mechanisms that are involved in cumulative cultural evolution. And these mechanisms can interact in interesting ways and can lead to different population outcomes. So, for example, Maimut Krishna and Joe Henrik have a paper where they talk about different kinds of mechanisms that generate innovations. So they talk about serendipity, where you're kind of accidentally coming across a good solution, or tweaking, or this kind of like refinement, the incremental improvement that I've talked about before. But they also talk about recombination, where you're not introducing any new information in the population, you're just kind of combining ideas that are already present in the population. And there's an older paper by Enkos et al. Where they look at how different kind of structures of dependencies between cultural traits affect, they look at growth rates and population outcomes, and they show that these things really matter. And I think this is really important because, again, for me, what's really special about cumulative cultural evolution is this fact that traits are interdependent. They're not just changing on their own, they all affect each other. So with this in mind, I'm going to talk about an agent-based model that I developed to kind of draw on these observations and look at how different learning mechanisms perform in a complex cultural task. So we designed here a modular task where traits depend on each other, and we compare learning through recombination and through refinement, and we also vary task difficulty. So here, an agent is trying to learn a sequence of steps. For each step, there are n options, each associated with a payoff. and they're trying to figure out what's the best payoff. So here, this learner picks trait E with the highest payoff, and then trait B, and so on. So if these steps were independent, then this would be simply a matter of picking for each step, the option with the highest payoff. But actually, here we constrain these payoffs to depend on the choices of previous steps. So basically here, when the task is easy and these steps don't really depend on each other, then the choice at every level does not affect the choices at the other level. So basically changing the B in the middle here to C wouldn't really affect the other payoffs. But when the task is hard and these levels are highly dependent on each other, then changing B to C, for example, would also affect the other payoffs a lot. So if we think of this as kind of like a grid with 5 steps, each with 5 options, we constrain the payoffs so that the payoffs received for each step, so every line here, depends on the previous 2 steps. So here, step 3 depends on step 2 and 1, and so on. So the way we did this is by multiplying each row with a function of the previous 2 choices. So let's say we pick option 2 here, then we multiply the second row by a Gaussian that has the mean at 2 and a standard deviation sigma. So this will look like this. The payoffs further away from the mean basically are penalized. And now again, if we, for the second option, we choose this option, then the payoffs for step 3 are penalized, taking into account both the first choice and the second choice, and we multiply these 2. So we wanted to capture the kind of like path dependency that you see in cumulative cultural evolution, where like the first choices really affect kind of like where you can go from there. The sigma of this distribution basically affects the difficulty of the task. So when the task is easy here, agents kind of have a lot of freedom and can pick whatever kind of paths that they want through this grid. But when the task is hard, actually solutions look more like here on the right. So you can't really like move that much from the previous choice. Right, so we ran these 3 conditions for an easy, medium, and hard task. And we also we varied how much the agents knew about this dependency. We had 3 algorithms where ranging from no dependency here to full knowledge of the full dependency. So basically, the nearsighted learner here only makes decisions using local knowledge about the current step, while the long-sighted learner can look ahead 2 steps and pick the option that maximizes the sum of the current step and the next step and the next step. And then we also tested how these things interact with these 2 learning mechanisms that are thought to be really important for cumulative cultural evolution. So, like I said, cultural recombination is basically rearrangement of these modular cultural traits that are inherited from parents, and refinement is incremental improvement. So the way the recombination worked was basically, the agent picks a number of parents, and then for every step it picks an option from one of the parents. But these options are payoff dependent, so they're more likely to copy from the parents that have higher payoffs. When refining, an individual basically copies the repertoire of a random parent and then picks an option, and if according to what the algorithm knows there's a better option here, then that level is updated. And then we also had a combined condition where first the agent learns through recombination that refines basically. We also had mutation in this, and we ran 500 repeat simulations where basically we initialized each population with individual learners learning the steps in random order. We ran a grid of 10 by 10. We had the 3 learning algorithms, the 3 conditions, 3 task difficulty values. We varied the number of models, the population size, and the mutation rate. I'm not going to talk about these today. Here are the results. Here I'm plotting standardized average payoffs at the end of the simulation. So here the 3 learning algorithms are recombination in yellow, combined in blue, and refinement in green. And there's 2 things to take from this. First, intelligence matters. So the long-sighted agents, the agents that know more about the dependencies, do better. But also there's an interaction between learning algorithm and condition. So here, for the nearsighted learners, actually condition doesn't seem to matter. All the agents do just as well. But for the long-sighted agents, actually, agents in the recombination condition do better. And there's an interaction with task difficulty. So basically, when the task is easy here, it seems like everybody's kind of doing the same. There's very little difference between learning algorithms. But when the task is hard, actually, recombination does the best. So, you know, when the task is easy, individual agents can kind of figure out things on their own. But when the task is hard, they kind of need this population level process. And this is really interesting, right? Because we're kind of pitting a cultural evolution process against, like, I guess, a cognitively more intense process. And in order to kind of understand what's happening here, what we think is doing is that recombination is maintaining more diversity, right? And that's allowing the population to kind of jump across these peaks. We ran a bunch of post hoc analyses to kind of understand what's going on. So we looked at different levels, different kind of measures of diversity. First, we looked at the cultural similarity between repertoires. So basically like population level diversity. And we measured this similarity as the proportion of steps with identical options. And we calculate this population similarity by averaging overall pairs of agents in the population. And you can see here in the combined condition, the one that's not doing as well, the similarity is really, really high. Almost 1 for these like nearsighted learners, for the nearsighted learners. In the refinement condition, we actually find quite a lot of diversity, but actually we think that's because refinement kind of converges on these separate lineages within the population. And recombination actually maintains kind of intermediate levels of diversity. So this pattern was consistent across a variety of measures. We also looked at evenness and distances and Gini coefficients. And we also were interested in whether, you know, not just the population maintains more variation, but also what happens at the repertoire level. So we measured diversity within repertoires. It's this thing we call repertoire uniformity, where basically, remember, because of the way the task is set up, it doesn't really pay to move away from the same option. So here we just kind of measured the numerical difference between consecutive steps across all agents in the population. So uniform repertoires look more like here, and these are diverse repertoires. And we found that when the task was easy, there wasn't much difference, but actually when the task was hard, again, recombination maintained more variation in this kind of repertoires, I guess. So, you know, it looks like through refinement, the population kind of converges when there's these different lineages of highly uniform repertoires, but through recombination, population actually maintain more variation, both at the population level and at the repertoire level. And, you know, sure, there's more diversity, but is this diversity actually useful? So in order to look at this, we kind of thought that via this repertoire level selection, recombination actually filters out these options that do not mix well with each other. So it's only kind of maintaining options that combine well with each other and result in high payoffs. So it's not just that, you know, again, recombination maintains more variation, but that variation is actually useful. So again, we designed a new measure called mixability, where basically we wanted to see that, you know, if we have 2 repertoires, for example, and if we shuffle these 2 together, do they still end up giving a high payoff? So the way we did this, we calculate this mixability at the end of the final generation, and we only took into account the repertoires that were still available in the population. Repertoires that are still available in the population. So let's say we only have these 2 repertoires in the population, then for the first step, we pick 1 or 6. For the second step, we pick 2 or 7, and so on. And this was done independent of the payoffs of those repertoires, just kind of like seeing what's in the population. And yes, we found that actually populations learning through recombination here maintain repertoires that are more mixable. So instead of converging on like one potentially suboptimal solution, recombination is actually flexible and allows the population to entertain several equally good solutions that combine well. So it's not necessarily that maybe one solution would have been better, but these 2 solutions that are in the population are actually a better combination of each other, right? Right. So to summarize, it looks like here, you know, intelligence is important, but it wasn't used as much. So long-sighted agents did better, but actually through recombination. So they actually only use their intelligence, if you want to call it that, in the first generation. So there's a strategic trade-off here between intelligence and relying on this population level process of payoff-based recombination. And when the task was easy and individuals kind of like local knowledge was enough to come up with good solutions, then all learning mechanisms did well. But when recombination does better, when the task is hard and kind of like pushing the population out, these suboptimal local peaks. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to thank my collaborators. And again, if you have questions about this, anything.